At the height of his influence, one man could shape elections without holding office, pass laws without writing them, and redirect public money without ever appearing on a ballot. He wasn't a dictator. He wasn't a general. He wasn't even elected. He was a fundraiser. Corporations courted him. Politicians feared losing him. Voters never knew his name. And yet, entire democracies bent around the incentives he helped create. The twist is this: democracy didn't collapse from a coup or a revolution. It was optimized, monetized, turned into a business model and sold back to the public as freedom. Democracy was not designed to be profitable. It was designed to limit power, to slow decisions, to force accountability, to make corruption harder, not easier. And for a long time it worked imperfectly, but sincerely. Votes were crude, systems were messy, participation was limited, but the idea was radical. Political authority would flow upward from the people, not downward from wealth or force. That idea survived monarchies, empires, and revolutions. What it wasn't prepared for was markets. The moment democracy intersected with modern finance, mass media, and professional incentives, its purpose began to shift. Not all at once, not by conspiracy, but by evolution. And like all systems that evolve under pressure, it optimized for what it rewarded. What democracy rewarded increasingly was not participation, but spending, not persuasion, but visibility, not ideas, but reach. To understand when democracy became a business model, we have to go back to a time when it very clearly was not. In its earliest forms, democracy was local, direct, and deeply personal. In ancient Athens, citizens voted themselves. There were no campaigns in the modern sense, no advertising, no consultants. Power was limited because scale was limited. Influence required presence. But even then, money mattered. Wealthy citizens funded public works, festivals, and naval ships. This wasn't charity, it was reputation management. Status translated into influence. The seeds were there. As democratic ideas resurfaced in the modern world, first in limited republics, then in mass democracies, the problem of scale returned. You could no longer gather everyone in one place. Representation replaced direct participation, and representation introduced distance. Distance created opportunity. In the early republics of Europe and America, politics was still relatively cheap. Campaigns were local. Media was limited to pamphlets and newspapers. Candidates were known personally or by reputation. Political parties were loose coalitions, not permanent machines. But industrialization changed everything. As populations exploded and cities grew, political communication scaled through mass media. Distribution networks needed advertisers. Political messaging began to cost money not incidentally, but structurally. At first, this was manageable. Parties raised funds from members, local patrons supported candidates. The system was imperfect, but influence was still fragmented. The turning point came with professionalization. By the late 19th and early 20th centuries, politics became a career. Parties built permanent organizations. Campaigns required logistics, staff, polling, messaging, travel. Running for office was no longer something you did between jobs. It was a job, and jobs need funding. This is where the logic quietly flipped. Democracy was supposed to be a mechanism for translating public will into policy. But as costs rose, it began translating funding capacity into viability. Those who could raise money were viable. Those who couldn't weren't. This didn't immediately corrupt outcomes, but it reshaped incentives. Candidates learned quickly that fundraising mattered more than policy depth. Time spent calling donors produced more tangible results than time spent refining ideas. This is not speculation. This is documented behavior. By the mid-20th century, especially in large democracies, elected officials spent enormous portions of their time fundraising, not governing, not legislating, fundraising. Money didn't buy votes directly, it bought attention. And attention in mass democracies is everything. The rise of broadcast media accelerated this shift dramatically. Radio, then television, transformed politics into performance. Message delivery mattered more than message substance. Campaigns were no longer won door-to-door, they were won on screens. And screens were expensive. Advertising time had to be purchased. Consultants emerged to manage image. Pollsters analyzed perception. Messaging became data-driven. Politics adopted the logic of marketing. This was the moment democracy began to resemble a business, not because it wanted to, but because it had to compete in an attention economy. As media fragmented and competition intensified, costs exploded. By the late 20th century, running for high office required massive funding. Entire industries grew around elections: campaign consultants, media strategists, fundraising platforms, compliance lawyers, data brokers. Democracy now had a supply chain. And, like any supply chain, it optimized for profit. Political parties became brands, candidates became products, voters became segments. Elections became recurring revenue events. None of this required corruption in the traditional sense. No bribes, no secret deals, just alignment of incentives. If winning requires money, and money comes from donors, then donors become a priority, not necessarily over voters, but over and donors. This subtle shift matters enormously. Most citizens vote, very few donate. An even smaller fraction donate large amounts. Those donors gain access not just to politicians, but to the political process itself. Meetings, phone calls, input on legislation, early drafts, framing. Again, this isn't conspiracy, it's logistics. When democracy scales, access becomes scarce. Scarcity is allocated by systems. Systems allocate by incentives. And incentives increasingly rewarded money. The breaking point didn't arrive with a single scandal. It arrived with normalization. By the early 21st century, massive campaign spending was no longer shocking. It was expected. Elections costing billions became routine. Fundraising targets escalated every cycle. At the same time, regulatory decisions expanded the role of money further. Court rulings framed political spending as protected expression. Limits loosened. New vehicles emerged. Superstructures formed around elections that operated continuously, not just during campaigns. Democracy was no longer an event. It was an industry, and like any industry, it sought growth. This growth created distortions. Policies that benefited narrow but wealthy interests gained traction. Issues affecting broad populations but lacking concentrated funding struggled for attention. Complex problems were simplified into slogans because nuance doesn't convert well. Media amplified outrage because outrage drives engagement. Engagement drives ad revenue. Political messaging adapted accordingly. The feedback loop was complete. Politicians needed money to win. Money came from donors. Donors wanted returns, not always financial, but regulatory, ideological, or strategic. Messaging optimized for fundraising. Media profited from conflict. Voters were polarized. Turnout fluctuated. Trust eroded. All while the system technically functioned as designed. Elections happened, votes were counted, power changed hands. But the experience of democracy felt increasingly hollow to many. This is where the fallout begins. When citizens perceive that outcomes are predetermined by money, participation declines or radicalizes, trust falls. Cynicism rises. Ironically, this fuels the business model further. Low trust increases spending. More spending increases professionalization. More professionalization increases distance. Distance increases mistrust. Attempts to fix the system often fail because they treat symptoms, not structure. Campaign finance reforms limit certain channels only for money to reroute through others. Transparency increases awareness, but not necessarily power redistribution. Voter education campaigns compete with billion-dollar messaging operations. The core problem remains untouched. Democracy is competing in a market environment it was never designed for. And markets reward scale, speed, and capital, not deliberation, patience, or equality. Modern parallels are impossible to ignore. Today, political data is harvested like consumer data. Voters are targeted with personalized messaging. Algorithms decide which issues surface. Attention is monetized in real time. Political engagement is measured in clicks. Outrage is A/B tested. Fundraising emails are optimized like e-commerce funnels. This isn't because politicians are uniquely immoral. It's because the system evolved under pressure. Democracy became a business model when winning required constant fundraising, constant visibility, and constant growth. The shocking part is that this model is self-reinforcing. As long as campaigns are expensive, fundraising will dominate. As long as fundraising dominates, access will skew. As long as access skews, outcomes will feel detached from popular will. This doesn't mean democracy is fake, it means it's stressed. Historically, stressed systems either adapt or fracture. Some countries experiment with public financing, spending caps, or media access rules. Results are mixed. Where reforms reduce costs, participation often improves. Where they don't, cynicism persists. But even reforms face resistance not just from elites, but from the industries that now depend on political spending. Remember, democracy as a business supports livelihoods, consultants, platforms, media outlets, data firms, entire ecosystems. Disrupting that threatens economic interests, not just political ones. This is why change is slow, and why the question I sent whether democracy is corrupted, but whether it can function sustainably under market logic. History suggests systems survive when incentives align with purpose. Right now, democracy's purpose is representation. Its incentives increasingly reward monetization. That gap is the real crisis. 3 takeaways stand out clearly. First, democracy didn't fail. It evolved under pressure. It evolved toward what it rewarded. Second, money doesn't need to buy votes to shape outcomes. It only needs to shape access and attention. Third, reform without incentive realignment treats symptoms, not causes. The warning is subtle but serious. Systems that prioritize profitability over legitimacy eventually lose both. And the open-ended question is this: if democracy is now an industry, who is it designed to serve and who is it quietly leaving behind? If this exploration helped you see modern politics not as chaos, but as a system with incentives and consequences, consider subscribing for more deep dives into power, history, and the structures shaping our world. Because the most important questions aren't about who wins elections, but about what winning now requires.